On the south side of Chicago in the 1920s, a plate of braciol on the table meant you were either family or about to become family. There was no third option. Al Capone understood this better than anyone running the neighborhood. He did not hold his most important meetings in back offices or hotel rooms. He held them at dinner tables covered with dishes his own mother could have made, and the men who sat across from him ate everything on the plate before anyone talked business. Number 20 took half a day to roll, stuff, and braise, and it only appeared when a deal needed settling. Number 9 showed up once a year in a tin, and the woman who made it never told anyone else the filling. And number 1 spent all Sunday on the stove and meant more at that table than any expensive cut of meat ever could. These were the meals that built trust, sealed agreements, and kept an entire neighborhood silent. Hit subscribe because here are 25 foods Al Capone ate that kept him untouchable for 7 years. Number 25. Supplì. A Roman rice croquette the size of a fist, stuffed with a nugget of mozzarella that pulled into a long string when you bit through the fried shell. The name came from the French word for surprise, and the surprise was always the same. Molten cheese in the center of a ball of yesterday's risotto, rolled in breadcrumbs and dropped into hot oil until the outside turned the color of rust. In the Italian neighborhoods on the near west side of Chicago, Supplì showed up at card games and christenings, stacked on a platter lined with brown paper that darkened with grease before the first hand was dealt. Capone's mother made them in the tenement kitchen in Brooklyn before the family moved west. The rice was cooked in tomato sauce, cooled overnight, shaped by hand the next morning. Every household had a slightly different ratio of rice to cheese, and every household believed theirs was correct. They were eaten standing up, still hot enough to burn the roof of your mouth, and nobody waited for them to cool because the cheese inside hardened if you let it sit. Number 24. Mostaccioli al forno. Every Italian household on the south side had a version of this baked pasta, and every one of them believed theirs was the only correct one. Mostaccioli are short tubes, cut on the diagonal, wider than penny, and rougher on the surface so the sauce holds. The pasta went into a deep baking dish, layered with meat sauce, ricotta, and sliced mozzarella. Then the whole thing went into the oven until the cheese on top browned and the edges of the pasta turned crisp. It came out heavy enough to anchor a table. In the Taylor Street neighborhood, Mostaccioli al forno appeared at every holiday, every wake, and every Sunday when extra company showed up without warning. You did not need a recipe. You needed a deep pan, a good sauce, and enough mozzarella to cover the top twice. Number 23. Braciol. Thin slices of beef pounded flat, spread with a mixture of garlic, parsley, grated cheese, and sometimes pine nuts or raisins, then rolled tight and tied with kitchen string before being browned in olive oil and simmered for hours in tomato sauce. The meat absorbed the sauce, and the sauce absorbed the meat, and by the time the rolls were pulled from the pot, they were tender enough to cut with a fork. Braciol was the centerpiece of the Sunday table in Southside Italian households, and the pot it cooked in was the same pot the family had been using for decades. The butcher on Taylor Street knew which cuts to slice thin for braciol and which families wanted them pounded thinner than others. Every roll was tied by hand, and every grandmother had an opinion about whether raisins belonged inside or whether that was a Sicilian habit that had no business in a Neapolitan kitchen. Number 22. Chicken Vesuvio. This dish does not exist in Italy. It was invented in Chicago by Italian-American cooks who named it after the volcano, probably because the potatoes came out of the oven dark and erupted with garlic when you cut into them. The chicken was browned in olive oil with whole cloves of garlic, then baked with potato wedges and a generous pour of white wine until the skin crisped and the potatoes turned golden. Dried oregano and a handful of peas went in near the end. The wine reduced into a pan sauce that tasted sharper than anything in a traditional Italian kitchen. Chicken Vesuvio became a staple of Italian-American restaurants across Chicago, and nearly every family in the old neighborhood had a home version. The potatoes mattered as much as the chicken. They absorbed the wine and the garlic oil and came out of the pan soft inside and almost burned on the outside. Number 21. Panelle. Chickpea flour mixed with water, cooked into a thick paste, spread flat on a board, and left to set until it firmed into slabs that could be sliced and fried in hot oil. The outside turned crisp and golden. The inside stayed soft, dense, and faintly nutty. Panelle came straight out of Palermo, and the Sicilian families in Chicago fried them the same way their mothers did on the other side of the ocean. They were eaten between bread as a sandwich or stacked on a plate alongside fried eggplant and a squeeze of lemon. The flour was cheap. A bag of it lasted weeks. A batch of panelle fed a table full of people for the cost of the oil it took to fry them. In the Italian neighborhoods, the smell of chickpea flour hitting hot oil carried through the hallway and told everyone on the floor what was for supper. Number 20. Caponata, a Sicilian sweet and sour eggplant dish that sat on the counter at room temperature and tasted better every hour it rested. The eggplant was cut into cubes and fried until golden, then folded into a slow-cooked mixture of celery, onions, tomatoes, capers, green olives, and a pour of red wine vinegar sweetened with a spoonful of sugar. The combination of acid and sweetness hit differently from anything else on the Italian table, and the texture ranged from firm celery to collapsing eggplant in the same bite. In the Sicilian households on the south side of Chicago, caponata was made in large batches in late summer when the eggplant came in heavy from the backyard garden or the pushcart vendors along Halsted Street. A single pot lasted the better part of a week because the flavor deepened as the vegetables sat in their own liquid, and by the third day the vinegar had mellowed and the sweetness had crept forward, and the whole thing tasted like a different dish than the one that came off the stove. Capone's family was Neapolitan by origin, but the Sicilians who surrounded them in Brooklyn and later in Chicago made caponata as a matter of course, and it crossed neighborhood lines the way few dishes did. It showed up on antipasto trays next to cold cuts and bread, and it showed up alone on a plate with nothing else because it did not need anything else. The women who made it adjusted the vinegar by taste, never by measure, and the result was a dish that no two kitchens produced the same way twice. Number 19. Struffoli. Dozens of small balls of dough, no bigger than a marble, fried in oil until golden and then tossed in warm honey until every piece was coated and glistening. The fried balls stuck together in a mound that looked like a golden beehive, and they were finished with a scatter of colored sprinkles or candied orange peel. Struffoli were Neapolitan Christmas, and no other dessert on the table carried the same weight. The dough was plain, just eggs, flour, butter, and a splash of anise liqueur. The frying had to be fast, so the inside stayed soft. The honey had to be warm enough to coat, but not so hot that it turned the dough soggy. A tray of struffoli at the center of the table lasted for days because people pulled off 3 or 4 pieces at a time, and the mound barely shrank. Number 18. Baccalà. Salt cod was one of the oldest preserved foods in the Mediterranean, and Italian immigrants carried the tradition straight into their American kitchens. The fish arrived hard as a board, packed in salt, and had to be soaked in cold water for 2 or 3 days before it could be cooked. Once rehydrated, the cod was either fried in a light batter, simmered in tomato sauce with olives and capers, or baked with potatoes and onions. In Italian-American neighborhoods, baccalà was the Friday dish. Catholic families did not eat meat on Fridays, and salt cod was the most reliable substitute because it kept indefinitely without refrigeration. A single piece of dried cod purchased at the beginning of the week could feed a family by Friday night. The preparation was slow, but the cost was low, and the flavor was deep, salty, and concentrated from the curing process. There is a logic to these dishes that has nothing to do with nostalgia. Every single one of them solves a problem. Too many mouths, not enough money, no refrigeration, no time, no recipe book. The Italian families who settled on the south side of Chicago in the early 20th century did not romanticize their cooking. They engineered it. And the people who sat at their tables, including the ones running the neighborhood, understood exactly what that engineering was worth. Number 17. Giardiniera. Chicago did something to this condiment that no other city replicated. Traditional Italian giardiniera is a mix of pickled vegetables and vinegar. The Chicago version replaced the vinegar base with oil, added sport peppers and crushed red pepper flakes, and turned it into something closer to a relish than a pickle. Celery, cauliflower, carrots, serrano peppers, and olives, all chopped fine and packed in oil with enough heat to clear your sinuses. In the old neighborhoods during Prohibition, Giardiniera was a staple of home kitchens long before it became famous on Italian beef sandwiches. Women made it in bulk at the end of summer when the vegetables were cheapest, packed it into jars, and stored it in the cellar for months. It went on bread, on eggs, on cold cuts, on anything that needed sharpening. Number 16. Polenta with sausage ragu. Polenta was the food of northern Italy, but southern Italians in America adopted it because cornmeal was cheap and available everywhere. The preparation was simple and slow. Cornmeal stirred into boiling water or broth for close to an hour, scraped constantly to prevent sticking until it thickened into a dense, creamy mass. Then it was poured onto a board or into a bowl and topped with a ragu made from Italian sausage broken into chunks and simmered in tomato sauce. In some households, the polenta was allowed to cool and firm up, then sliced and fried in oil the next day. That fried version was almost better than the original. The sausage ragu did double duty. It flavored the polenta on the first night, and the leftover sauce went onto pasta later in the week. 1 pot of ragu, 2 full meals. Number 15. Zeppole. Balls of fried dough dusted with powdered sugar, served hot from the oil at every Italian street festival and feast day in Chicago. The dough was simple: flour, water, yeast, a pinch of salt, and sometimes an egg. It rose for an hour, then was torn into rough pieces and dropped into a deep pot of oil where it puffed and turned golden in under a minute. The outside cracked when you bit into it. The inside was hollow and soft and tasted like warm bread that had decided to become a pastry. Zeppole were sold from carts at the Feast of San Gennaro, at church carnivals on Taylor Street, and at any gathering large enough to justify heating a pot of oil outdoors. They cost almost nothing to make, and the line for them never shortened because they had to be eaten within minutes of frying or the texture collapsed into something chewy and flat. Number 14. Pasta con la sarde. A Sicilian dish built around fresh sardines, wild fennel, pine nuts, currants, and a thread of saffron that turned the pasta pale yellow. The sardines were cleaned and opened flat, then layered with the cooked fennel and tossed with bucatini or persiatelli in a sauce that was equal parts sweet, briny, and herbal. In Sicily, the dish depended on wild fennel gathered from the hillsides, but in Chicago, the Sicilian families on the south side substituted the feathery tops of cultivated fennel bulbs and adjusted the flavor with an extra pinch of fennel seed. The combination of fish and fruit struck outsiders as strange, but the families who made it understood that the currants cut the salt of the sardines the way nothing else could. It was a Friday dish, a fast day dish, a dish that proved a cook could build complexity without a single piece of meat in the pot. Number 13. Trippa alla parmigiana. Tripe is the stomach lining of a cow, and most Americans alive today have never touched it. But in the Italian neighborhoods of the 1920s and 30s, tripe was one of the cheapest cuts available at the butcher, and Neapolitan cooks knew exactly what to do with it. The tripe was cleaned, boiled until tender, cut into strips, and simmered in tomato sauce with onions, garlic, and a heavy dusting of grated Parmigiano Reggiano. The long simmer turned the rubbery texture into something almost silky, and the cheese melted into the sauce and gave the whole dish a richness that had no connection to its cost. Most American-born customers walked right past the tripe counter without a second look. The Italian families lined up for it every week because they understood what the rest of the city had not figured out yet. Number 12. Cotoletta alla Milanese. A bone-in veal chop, pounded thin, dredged in flour, dipped in beaten egg, coated in fine breadcrumbs, and fried in butter until the crust turned golden and the meat inside stayed pink. This was not a cheap dish. Veal cost more than beef or pork, and the butter added to the expense. But cotoletta showed up on special occasions and at the tables of families who had a little more than their neighbors. In the hierarchy of Italian-American cooking in Chicago, A veal cutlet on the table meant something had gone right that week. The breadcrumb crust shattered when you cut into it, and the butter left a richness that olive oil could not match. A squeeze of lemon across the top was the only finishing touch. Some families served it with a handful of arugula dressed in oil and salt. The dish needed nothing else. Number 11. Broccoli rabe with sausage. The rabe was bitter, almost aggressively so, and that bitterness was the reason it worked. The greens were blanched in salted water to pull out the sharpest edge, then sautéed in olive oil with sliced garlic and crumbled Italian sausage until the fat from the meat glazed every leaf and the garlic turned soft enough to spread. The dish came together in less than 20 minutes and required nothing more than a loaf of bread to soak up the oil at the bottom of the pan. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, broccoli rabe was one of the greens that separated the Southern Italians from everyone else on the block. The Irish families next door did not recognize it. The Polish households across the alley had never seen it. But in the houses where Calabrese and Neapolitan was spoken at the table, that bitter green showed up twice a week and nobody needed to be told what it was. Capone understood something about food that had nothing to do with flavor. A table with good food on it changed the terms of a conversation. A plate passed from hand to hand created an obligation that no contract could match. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, feeding someone was not just hospitality, it was leverage. And the dishes on those tables were the currency of a system that ran on trust, memory, and the understanding that a shared meal carried weight long after the plates were cleared. Number 10. Frittura mista. A platter of whatever could be battered and fried. Sliced zucchini, artichoke hearts, cauliflower florets, rings of squid, small pieces of salt cod, and sometimes slices of lemon that turned crisp and edible in the hot oil. The batter was thin, barely more than flour and water with a splash of white wine, and it set into a shell so light it shattered on contact. Frittura mista showed up on Christmas Eve as part of the feast, on Easter as a side, and on any Friday when the household needed a meal that felt like a celebration without spending like one. The oil was heated in a deep cast iron pot, and the cook stood over it with a slotted spoon, pulling each piece the moment the color turned right. The kitchen smelled like a restaurant for the rest of the evening, and the platter was picked clean before it reached the table because everyone who walked through the kitchen took a piece on the way past. Number 9. Ricotta pie. A baked custard made from fresh ricotta, eggs, sugar, a scrape of lemon zest, and a few drops of vanilla, poured into a pastry shell, and baked until the top browned in spots and the filling set into something dense, creamy, and barely sweet. Ricotta pie was Easter in the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, and the preparation started days before the holiday. The ricotta was drained overnight in cheesecloth to pull out the excess moisture, because wet ricotta made a soggy filling that never set properly. The eggs were beaten whole, not separated, and the sugar was kept low because the point of the pie was the ricotta itself, that clean, milky, slightly grainy flavor that no other cheese could replicate. Some families added candied citron or miniature chocolate chips to the filling. Others considered any addition a corruption of the original and made the pie with nothing but ricotta, eggs, sugar, and zest. The pies were baked in wide, shallow tins and carried to Easter dinner, wrapped in dish towels. They were served at room temperature, sliced thin, because a small piece was rich enough to end a meal that had already lasted 3 hours. The women who made them kept their crusts short and crumbly with lard instead of butter, and the pastry dissolved on the tongue before the filling fully registered. Capone hosted Easter gatherings where ricotta pie appeared alongside bowls of colored eggs and platters of lamb, and the pie was always the last thing left on the table because people came back for second and third slices long after everything else had been cleared. Number 8. Conchiglioni ripieni. Large pasta shells, boiled just until pliable, stuffed one by one with a mixture of ricotta, mozzarella, egg, and parsley. Then laid in a baking dish, covered with tomato sauce and more mozzarella, and baked until the cheese melted and the edges of the shells turned crisp where they poked above the sauce. Stuffed shells were the dish you made when company was coming and you wanted the table to look abundant. A single baking dish held 2 or 3 dozen shells, and the visual impact of that many neatly arranged, sauce-covered shells was immediate. The ricotta filling was mild and creamy, and the tomato sauce around it gave the whole dish color and acidity. The shells themselves, where they rose above the sauce line, developed a texture somewhere between pasta and cracker. This was not subtle food. It was built to fill a room and a table at the same time. Number 7. Ossobuco, a cross-cut veal shank, braised slowly in white wine, broth, tomatoes, and aromatics until the meat surrendered from the bone and the marrow inside turned soft enough to scoop out with a spoon. The marrow was the prize. It was rich, almost buttery, and carried a depth of flavor that no other part of the animal could match. Ossobuco was a dish of patience. The shanks needed several hours of low heat before they reached the point where the connective tissue dissolved and the sauce thickened into something closer to a glaze. Milanese tradition called for a gremolata on top, a raw mixture of parsley, lemon zest, and garlic that cut through the richness of the braise. In the Italian restaurants of Chicago, ossobuco was the dish that separated a serious kitchen from one that was cutting corners. You could tell by the marrow whether the cook had let the pot sit long enough or whether they had rushed it. Number 6. Pasta alla norma, a Sicilian dish named after the Bellini opera, built on fried eggplant, tomato sauce, fresh basil, and a shower of salted ricotta that crumbled over the top like dry snow. The eggplant was sliced into rounds, salted to draw out the moisture, and fried in olive oil until each piece turned deep brown and collapsed into something almost creamy. The tomato sauce was plain, garlic, crushed tomatoes, and nothing else. The pasta was rigatoni, or penne, something with ridges to catch the sauce. When the dish was assembled, the fried eggplant sat on top of the dressed pasta, and the ricotta salata went over everything. The salt from the cheese and the sweetness from the fried eggplant pulled against each other in a way that made every bite slightly different from the last. In the Sicilian households on the south side, pasta alla norma was a summer dish, made when the eggplant was cheap and abundant and the tomatoes were still warm from the garden. Number 5. Torta rustica, a double-crusted savory pie stuffed with layers of cured meats, hard-boiled eggs, and cheese, baked until the pastry turned dark gold and the filling fused into a dense, salty mosaic when you sliced it crosswise. Soppressata, capicola, and fresh mozzarella were the usual layers, but every family varied the filling with whatever cured meat they had on hand. Torta rustica was Easter food, made the day before and served cold or at room temperature alongside the ham and the ricotta pie. It traveled well, it kept for days, and a single slice was heavy enough to count as a full meal. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, a woman who brought a torta rustica to a gathering did not need to bring anything else. The pie said everything about her kitchen without a word. Number 4. Scarola e fagioli, escarole and white beans cooked together in a pot with garlic, olive oil, and a piece of prosciutto rind or a ham bone for depth. The escarole wilted into the broth and turned silky, and the beans softened until the edges broke down and thickened the liquid into a pot so dense you could not tell where the greens ended and the beans began. The bitterness of the escarole and the creaminess of the cannellini balanced each other so precisely that neither one dominated. In Italian-American households, scarola e fagioli was the Thursday night answer to a kitchen that had nothing dramatic left for the week. A head of escarole, a can of cannellini, a clove of garlic, and a pour of oil. The dish was ready in under 30 minutes and left everyone at the table full without anyone noticing how little had gone into the pot. Number 3. Cicoria, wild chicory greens, foraged from empty lots and roadside patches or bought in bunches at the open-air markets along South Halsted. The greens were boiled in salted water until the bitterness mellowed, then drained and sautéed in olive oil with garlic and a pinch of red pepper. The finished dish was dark green, almost black, and it glistened with oil. Cicoria was served alongside bread and white beans, and the combination of the bitter greens, the starchy beans, and the bread to soak up the oil made a complete meal from ingredients that cost almost nothing. Southern Italian families in Chicago ate cicoria the way their parents ate it in the villages around Bari and Lecce. The taste was an acquired thing. Children pushed it to the side of the plate. Adults who had grown up on it could not imagine a week without it. The bitterness was the flavor of home, and no amount of time in a new country changed that. These are not the dishes of a man who lived lavishly. They are the dishes of a neighborhood that knew how to eat well on very little. Capone's power did not come from imported wines or restaurant reservations. It came from the same place the food came from, the old country, the family table, and the unspoken agreement that whoever feeds you has earned something in return. Number 2. Calzone. A half-moon of pizza dough folded over a filling of ricotta, mozzarella, and whatever cured meat the kitchen had on hand, sealed at the edges by pressing a fork through the dough, and baked until the crust turned golden and the cheese inside melted into a molten pocket. Calzones were portable in a way that pizza was not. You could wrap one in paper and carry it to a job site, eat it cold on a train, or hand it to someone on the way out the door. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, calzones were the food of convenience before that word meant anything. The same dough that made pizza on Saturday night became calzones on Monday morning. The filling changed with the season and the pantry, but the structure stayed the same. Fold, press, bake, eat. A calzone asked nothing of the person eating it except an appetite. Number 1. Sunday gravy, not a sauce, a gravy. The distinction mattered, and anyone who called it sauce in front of a Neapolitan grandmother learned that quickly. The pot went on the stove before dawn. Pork ribs, beef chuck, a few links of sweet sausage, and sometimes a piece of braciol went into the oil first, browned on all sides until the bottom of the pot was dark with fond. Then the tomatoes, crushed by hand from cans or passed through a food mill if the household still owned one. Garlic, basil, a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes were too sharp. The lid went on crooked so the steam could escape, and the gravy cooked for 5, 6, sometimes 7 hours on a flame so low you had to put your hand over the burner to feel it. The meat came out tender enough to fall apart when you looked at it. The gravy itself had reduced into something thick, dark, and sweet that clung to rigatoni like it had been made for nothing else. In the Italian neighborhoods of Chicago, Sunday gravy was not a recipe. It was a schedule. The house smelled like tomatoes and pork by 8 in the morning, and by noon the neighbors knew what you were eating. Capone grew up in a household where that pot was law. Every Sunday, without exception, regardless of what else was happening in the world outside the kitchen. The meal that came out of it was the longest of the week. Pasta first, then the meat on a separate plate, then salad, then fruit, then coffee. The gravy held all of it together. The family sat until the pot was empty, and the pot was never empty fast enough. Nobody at those tables called it strategy. They called it dinner. They called it Christmas Eve. They called it showing up with a covered dish when a neighbor lost a job. Capone sat where the food was, and the food was always in the kitchens of people who carried every recipe across the Atlantic without writing a single one down. If these dishes were on your family's table, you already know what they were worth.